The Reunification War, the Star League's crusade to unite all of humanity under one banner, finally came to a close on September 22, 2596 with the surrender of the last Periphery holdout, the Taurian Concordat. It was the most bloody conflict in human history, surpassing the Second World War, which had held that distinction for over 600 years. But by 2596, two of the ISB realms had already been living under Star League occupation for the better part of a decade. Jumping back in time to July 25, 2585, the Outworlds Alliance became the first to surrender, and was the only one not to do so unconditionally. Avalar had pushed for equal membership in the Star League for the Outworlds, but ultimately had to accept protectorship status. Also denied to him was Amos Forlo, who the Alliance president wanted to see tried for genocide against his people. The final cost to the realm was 23 planets lost, split between the Federated Suns and Draconis Combine, a war that had left the nation trillions out of pocket, and a death toll of over 12 million, the vast majority of which were civilians butchered by Forlo. If President Grigory Avalar thought his troubles would be over after the Treaty of Cerberus came into effect, he was very much mistaken. The Periphery Policy Council, established by the Star League to administer the new nations as they were conquered, dispatched Lady Claudia Cameron Davis to Alpharats to take charge of the recovery efforts. Also leaving for the Outworlds was Duke Anton Rates from the Federated Suns, who would look out for Davian interests during the transition. Straight away the three clashed, and Lady Claudia used her influence to make things difficult for the Alliance. The majority of the recovery funds were diverted to either worlds now belonging to the Draconis Combine or to new Star League and SLDF facilities, rather than projects that would help the locals. Protests from the Outworlds government went largely unnoticed by the Star League. Despite the surrender, riots and guerrilla resistance continued on many planets. To counter these attacks, 5th Corps would leave a sizable detachment behind to form the Outworlds Alliance Army of Occupation, while the rest of the unit prepared to muster out back to the Capellan Confederation. This army remained under Major General Franklin Barnax, who had not yet departed. When a series of terrorist attacks threatened stability, Cameron Davis tried to order the SLDF to disarm and dissolve the OAM, but these orders were countermanded by Barnax. This tense standoff continued between the government and the Star League administrators for some time. Change only came when evidence of corruption surfaced. Cameron Davis and her Kurita allies had been using recovery funds to purchase goods and raw materials, then selling them on within the inner sphere. Finally, the Star League took notice and had Lady Claudia removed from office. Her replacement, Frederick Kuryukin, arrived in September and started to set things right. Unfortunately, this came too late for Grigory Avalar. On August 2, 2587, the president was found dead in his bedchambers from an apparent heart attack. His son Barton was sworn in later that month and made a point of declaring that his father had died from the stresses involved with the invasion and occupation of his realm. What wasn't disclosed was that his father's heart attack had been brought on by a drug overdose during a soiree with two of his mistresses. Regardless, the Reunification War had taken its first head of state. Magistrix Crystalla Centrella had surrendered Canopus on April of 2584, but crucially, not the Magistracy itself. After the government was overturned, Captain General Marian Marek took over as military governor in addition to running the campaign. Only with the surrender of Colonel Adam Buquar of the MAF on December 9, 2588 was the Second Periphery realm finally conquered. Unlike the Outworlds Alliance, the Canopian surrender had been unconditional, and they no longer retained the right to self-governance, nor any say within the Star League. In addition to the 3 worlds that had voluntarily rejoined the Free Worlds League earlier in the war, another 11 planets were temporarily transferred to the Mareks. One of these was the planet Thurrock, which had briefly been claimed by the Capellan Confederation during the Third Andurian War, effectively removing the shared border between them and the Magistracy. With Marian returning home at the end of 2588, appointed in her stead as military governor was Duchess Melissa Humphreys of the Andurian province. Her presence and fair hand would ultimately lead to the Magistracy becoming one of the most successful of the post-war occupations. The abuses of power seen in the Outworlds did not reoccur here. In fact, she helped transition the realm from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one with more rights for its citizens, with several checks on the Magistrix's power. Crystalla Centrella had been removed from office, but she remained a figurehead for those who were opposed to the occupation. During the war, partisan resistance had been comparatively light in the Magistracy, but now the more extreme elements rose to the surface, and here like everywhere, riots and bombings became commonplace. The former Magistrix tried to put a stop to this by making public appeals to these extremists and declaring her intention not to seek a restoration of her former position. Instead, when the time came, her daughter Renala would become the new Magistrix designate. Sadly, General Ian Marek, who had played an instrumental role in keeping his auxiliary corps' conduct respectful throughout the campaign, would not get to see the positive changes the Magistracy would soon undergo. In January 2591, Ian collapsed while out walking and fell into a coma from which he would never wake. He passed away 2 years later on August 13th. After the conclusion of Operation Mailed Fist, First Consul Gregory Amaris was restored to power. His supposed loyalty and contributions to the siege of Terra Prime and the Rim Provisional Government had won him enough favour within the Star League. Unlike the other Periphery states, no military governor was ever appointed for the Rimworld's Republic, and Amaris even gained limited authority over the SLDF forces within his realm. He would use them to re-establish his authority over the fractured Republic. The situation in the Taurian Concordat was different to anywhere else. Active battles between the SLDF and TDF continued even after the official surrender, not to mention civilian resistance on dozens of occupied worlds. With Marantha Calderon dead, there was no leader to try and put a stop to these. Lord Damien Anaga began the hunt for someone with the authority to take over as protector, but soon discovered that most of the Calderon family and their government were either dead or had fled. Those that could be found vehemently refused to work with the Star League. Eventually, Marantha's young nephew, Henry Calderon, an inexperienced subaltern within the TDF, agreed to take on the role on January 3, 2597. In so doing, he was immediately ostracised by the rest of his family, and most of his nation viewed him as a traitor. Across the Concordat, Taurians were calling for his death. The outcome of the war was more severe for the Concordat than anywhere else. A full 36 planets were forcefully removed. 12 were immediately seized by House Davian, who was particularly keen to cut the border between the Taurians and Capellans in the same way the Marics had done with the Canopians. The remaining 24 worlds were operated as an independent territory of the Star League. On March 21, 2597, the 4 Periphery realms were officially inducted into the Star League as territorial states. In this role, they were very much subservient to the member states, and had precious few liberties. The SLDF retained a heavy presence within each of their nations, though the nature of the occupation varied between realms. Henry Calderon has spent his first year in power rebuilding the devastated Taurian government. Hardly anyone remained from the pre-war days, and few were willing to work with him. As 2598 rolled around, he began a tour of the realm, visiting the fractured and devastated worlds now under his purview. Not a single planet welcomed him on his visits, and on every world he was the target of at least one attempt on his life. Thankfully, for both the Star League and the Concordat's sake, not to mention Henry's, his security detail kept him safe throughout this period. Many rebel groups continued to fight within the Taurian Concordat after the war's conclusion. One such group was operating out of the Badlands cluster, and the 3rd Royal Brigade was sent in after them in late 2597. Nicholas Cameron, after a brief return to Earth to marry his fiancée, was back at the front early the next year, now acting as the 1st Royal Division's Chief of Staff. The rest of First Corps moved to the Spinwind end of the Concordat in March. In November 2599, Nicholas was promoted to Lieutenant General and became the 1st Royal Division's Assistant Commander. During a visit to the front line over Christmas, the First Lord's son was injured when a piece of shrapnel punctured his cockpit on January 4th. He was lucky to escape with minor injuries. His luck ran out a few days later. On the 7th, his unit ran into an ambush and the heir to the Terran Hegemony's mech was trashed. Only the timely arrival of his old unit saved his life, though he would lose an arm. He arrived back on Earth on the 1st of June and would retire from the military service as a many times decorated veteran. Across the Inner Sphere, Gregory Amaris was just about to celebrate his 3rd year of freedom, but unfortunately for him, his military chiefs had other ideas. Admiral Hakim Wabika had been released from prison after the war's conclusion and returned to service in Amaris's reformed RWA. He was, however, despondent to discover that Gregory had seemingly not learned any of the lessons he'd suffered during the conflict, and was just as inconsiderate a ruler as ever. Acting in collusion with most of the other senior commanders, on August 11, 2599, they had Amaris arrested and executed. In his place, they propped up his son Richard as a puppet. Behind the scenes though, it was Wabika and his aide General Samuel Macau, former 7th Dragoons commander, that ran the show. Barton Avalor has slowly subsumed responsibilities from Frederick Kuryukin since becoming the Outworlds president back in 87. However well-intentioned his policies might have been, his efforts to pit Kurita and Davian interest against each other for his own gain was about to come back to bite him. The Draconis industrialist orchestrated a bloodless coup and replaced Barton with his younger brother Rodrigo Avalor. His backers were shocked when, rather than show his gratitude, Rodrigo turned to the Star League and saw to it that those merchants were thrown out of the alliance altogether, for interfering with the government of an independent nation. Afterwards, he showed himself to be better suited to the role of president than his brother, and won back the favour of his 2 immediate neighbours in the coming years. Things had been largely peaceful in the Magistracy for the better part of 5 years come 2602. The last gasp of rebellion had come in 97 with the attempted kidnapping of Marian's great-granddaughter, Rianne Marek, along with Renala Centrala's daughter, Carla. things threatened to flare up again when the Star League ruled that the 11 disputed border worlds would become permanent additions to the Free Worlds League. But many had anticipated that, and by then, Melissa Humphrey's good neighbour policies were bringing a serious boom to the Periphery realm. Rennala Centrella had defied expectations and shown herself to be a fair and wise ruler, and on March 21, 2604, at Humphrey's urging, the Magistracy government was reinstated in full and granted the right to self-governance. Richard Amaris, meanwhile, had cautiously built a loyal cabal within his palace guard, and by August 17, 2604, was ready to launch a counter-coup of his own. During an argument between Wabika and Macau, the signal was given and the military junta was overthrown. In the aftermath, the Amarises reclaimed complete control over the Rimworld's Republic. After a decade as the Taurian Concordat's protector, Henry Calderon had managed to win a begrudging respect from his people. He did this by showing himself not to be a Star League catspaw, routinely standing up to Lord Damien Onaga and his later replacement Garth Quinteros. Over time, he made repeated proposals to the First Lord that Ian Cameron took him up on, and gradually the Taurians won back their freedoms. In October 2605, the SLDF's Army of Occupation completed the year-long process of pulling out of the Concordat. On December 7, 2607, after over a decade of outside occupation, the 4 Periphery realms were inducted into the Star League as associate members. In this role, they would regain the right to self-governance, those who hadn't already, and had the privilege of a seat on the High Council. What they lacked, however, was the right to cast a vote during those meetings. Voting would remain exclusive to the founding member states. It could be argued that it was this decision that would ultimately lead to the Star League's downfall some 200 years later. And with that, the last chapter of the bloodiest era in human history came to a close. Ahead of them was the good years of the 27th century, where the Star League rose to become the apex of human civilization. The League during this time defied the Doubters and was able to live up to the heady promises that had been made at its inception. Even the Periphery realms would come to benefit and in time respect the Cameron line, though they would always remember and honour those killed during the war. It is a great tragedy that so few of those who suffered through the Reunification War would live to see the Golden Century. Grigori Avalar had died on August 2, 2587, becoming the first head of state to pass away during the conflict. Later that year, David Santos was killed at Montor on October 16th, his protector Mitchell Calderon passing away shortly after on the 27th. Hahiro Kurita became the first of the Star League Council Lords to pass when he tripped and fell to his death on 11th of July 2591. Henry Graham, who almost succeeded in withdrawing the Lyran Commonwealth from the Star League, was killed by his Archon on January 15th the next year, but it wasn't long before Viola Steiner Dinesen followed him to her own grave on April 28, 2596. Also killed during the fighting on Apollo was Catherine Dormex, whose simple act of refusal to kill innocents plunged her realm into an awful civil war. Marion Marek, who had been such a positive influence on the conduct of the war on the Canopian front, died on June 10, 2598, tragically outliving her son by 5 years. Ursula Liao, who had steered a pacifist course for the Capellans and made many enemies doing it, passed away childless on June 25, 2599. Gregory Amaris was executed by his top admiral on the 11th of August soon after. Alexander Davian, who had lived through the worst period in his nation's history but reforged it into something great again, passed on January 24, 2600, after 60 years of uncontested rule. The Camerons suffered their own loss soon after when Chandra Narof Cameron died on the 8th of May, shortly before her son returned home from the Badlands cluster. Her husband, the First Lord, whose determination had forged the Star League from nothing, died on August 24, 2602, and was succeeded by his son Nicholas. Ian's longtime friend Carlos Dangmer Lee followed him later that year, on the 7th of November. Adam Buqua, whose conduct and talent during the war had been first class, was killed on February 20th, 2604 by a Canopian extremist. Charles Mainstein Wexworth and Welkins Nord passed away on the 27th of December 2605 and 9th of April 2610 respectively. The former Magistrix Cristalla Centrella lived to see her nation as a free state again, and saw her daughter become a great ruler in her own right. She died on June 13, 2611, and sadly, Rennala followed her mother on January 7, 2613, after a short battle with cancer. Elias Pitcairn died on January 27, 2616. The Duke of Regulus and the Duchess of Andurian passed away the following decade, Narinda Salaj on May 11, 2621, and Melissa Humphreys on February 18, 2624. Nathan Isaacson, who had conducted the Rimworlds campaign, died on October 19, 2631. Then Amos Forlow, who had made possible the victories against the Outworlds and Concordat, died on August 30, 2639, outliving his many victims by half a century. The young Lord Damien Onaga, last of the great Reunification war generals, lived until October 30th, 2653.